Welcome back to AIPAC's interview series, Israel's Multi-Front Threats, where we explore the pressing security challenges facing Israel. Today, we look at Lebanon. As Israel fights to destroy Hamas and free the hostages in Gaza, the far greater danger of an expanded war with Hezbollah in Lebanon is looming larger by the day. Iran's terror army in Lebanon is far greater, far better trained, and far better equipped than Hamas in Gaza. Since October 7th, Hezbollah has repeatedly attempted to infiltrate Israeli territory and has launched more than 2,000 rockets, missiles, and drones into northern Israel. Nearly 100,000 Israelis have been internally displaced as a result. A war with Hezbollah would have catastrophic consequences for Israel, Lebanon, and the entire region. Joining us today to discuss the threat from Lebanon is Dr. Matthew Levitt, renowned Middle East expert on Hezbollah and counterterrorism at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Dr. Levitt, welcome. Thank you for being here with us today.
Thanks for having me.
So the world's focus is really on Hamas and on the Gaza Strip, but as we know, the northern border has been a hot border since really October 7th. Talk to us about what that border has looked like and what's happened since this war began in Lebanon.
So, since Hamas infiltrated Israeli territory and carried out the October 7th massacres, Hezbollah has been firing rockets into Israel, almost solely Kornet anti-tank guided missiles, which is important because it explains why Israel is asking for Hezbollah to move about 10 kilometers from the border. That's the far range of the newer Kornet anti-tank guided missile. But they've also been helping Hamas and Islamic Jihad operatives fire rockets and try and infiltrate into Israel. And it has been just an ongoing day-by-day mini war. Both sides, Israel and Hezbollah, are wary of escalating to full-scale war, but the potential for something to go a little bit wrong, you aim at one thing and it hits something else, for miscalculation is very, very high. And as you mentioned, Hezbollah is far more capable, far better armed, far better trained than Hamas. This would be a war of a different caliber.
You know, if we had seen some of the attacks from Hezbollah into Israel in the absence of October 7th, we think this would escalate really into an all-out war. Why don't you think this has escalated into that wider war that so many people have feared?
There are two sets of issues here. One is there's always been kind of a rules of the game between Hezbollah and Israel. There's a separate rules of the game before the October 7th attack, and now there's another set of rules now. But Hezbollah, even before October 7th, was trying to kind of move the goalposts on those rules. So if Israel didn't kill a Hezbollah operative, if Israel didn't strike something in Lebanon, Hezbollah basically wouldn't retaliate. But Israel could hit whatever weapons shipments in Syria wanted. Now, in this context, there's new rules of the game in terms of, what type of target do you hit? How far into Lebanon or far into Israel is it? Hezbollah has almost solely been targeting military targets, which doesn't make it okay, but it's different. Hezbollah could hit civilian targets, and they haven't yet. The bottom line, Lebanon is in a severe political and, even more importantly, economic crisis. And nobody but perhaps the most extreme people within Hezbollah want a war right now. That's not what the Lebanese want, and they understand they'd blame Hezbollah. Second, Iran, for all of its hatred of Israel, doesn't want Hezbollah to use its most sophisticated rockets against Israel right now because Iran sees those as a deterrent against Israel or anybody else carrying out an attack on their nuclear program, or if they do, they see those weapons as being their best option for a second strike capability.
So you mentioned some of the weapons that Hezbollah has in its arsenal. We know that they're far more complicated, far more advanced weapons in their arsenal compared to Hamas. Talk to us a little bit more about that. What can you tell us about Hezbollah's military capabilities, and what would an all-out war with Hezbollah look like?
So first of all, Hezbollah has many more forces, many more highly trained forces. The forces of Hamas that carried out October 7th, called Hamas's Nukba Special Forces, they're modeled on Hezbollah's Radwan Special Forces, many of whom just got a lot of experience fighting in Syria. They have a lot more weaponry, but they also have things like the Kornet anti-tank guided missile, clearly, without limit. They have things like short-range, very high-powered mortars like the Burkan, which they've used a couple of times. They've re-engineered a couple of Israeli rockets, one of which they fired at an Israeli Northern Command headquarters recently. But most significantly, they've got somewhere around 150,000, maybe as many as 200,000 rockets, missiles, projectiles of different types. Most of those are not smart rockets. They get fired at a neighborhood and it hits what it hits. It's a terrorist weapon by definition. Some of them are what we call precision-guided missiles, or PGMs, and these, you don't fire those at a city and just hope for the best. You don't fire them at a neighborhood or a block or a building but a window. And so because of those, and because of the large number of missiles, they could overwhelm even Israel's four-tiered anti-missile system, David's Sling, Iron Dome, etc. And the expectation would be that Hezbollah would be able to knock out Israeli electricity grids, Israeli desalination plants. The expectation is you'd see significant numbers of killed and wounded. It would be a war of a different kind, one that I'm sure Israel would win, but that would be very, very painful.
Let's talk a little bit more about Iran. We know Hezbollah is armed and funded by the Iranian regime. Talk to us about that relationship today. What does the support from Iran to Hezbollah look like?
The first thing to understand about the Iranian-Hezbollah relationship is that it goes back to the beginning. Right after the Iranian Revolution, the Iranian government set out not only to have a revolution at home, but to export that revolution. They built departments and agencies that were specifically about exporting that revolution. In the first place was Lebanon, and the first experiment was Hezbollah. Ever since then, the relationship has gotten stronger and stronger. It is ideologically bound, not just a situation of I'm indebted to you, Iran, because you give me money and weapons. They are fellow travelers. And under the late Qasem Soleimani, the former general of the Quds Force, who was killed several years ago, January, he really kind of brought Hezbollah more under his control, in particular in Syria. So this Hezbollah today effectively is part of the Revolutionary Guard Corps, part of the Quds Force. Because of this relationship, because of the significant investment in funds, about $800 million to $1 billion with a B dollars a year, tremendous weapon systems of the type you can't get from anybody but a state. So we're talking about drones, we're talking about unmanned naval vehicles, we're talking about all kinds of weaponry that make Hezbollah a completely different type of threat.
There have been recent diplomatic efforts, as you mentioned earlier, to get Hezbollah to pull back from southern Lebanon. We know that that was part of a Security Council resolution after the 2006 war between Israel and Hezbollah. What's the state of these negotiations and this diplomacy today?
So the first thing to stress here is that since 2006, there's been UN Security Council Resolution 1701, which explicitly calls on Hezbollah to redeploy north of the Litani River. All of these actions, military and otherwise, that are happening in southern Lebanon are an express violation of international law. Not Israel's preference, but UN Security Council resolutions. Today, the United States, sending Amos Hochstein in particular, but Brett McGurk to some other places. The French have sent some very senior officials. The Germans have sent mostly intelligence officers. There's a very strong effort to explain to Hezbollah that Israel is serious about wanting and needing to be able to return the almost 100,000 citizens who've been evacuated from the north back to their homes. Their lives have been disrupted. They're put up in hotels. The government is paying for that. Separate from that cost, there's the cost of lost business, etc. And Israel's made it very clear. Either there's a negotiated settlement, not that pushes Hezbollah all the way back to under 1701 to the Litani River, which is what should happen, but 10 kilometers. And that magic number, 10 kilometers, is not pulled out of the air. It's because that's the extended range of the latest Cornet anti-tank guided missile. That's the primary weapon that Hezbollah has been firing into Israel multiple times a day. And so when Israeli defense officials met with mayors and heads of local regional councils in the north and said, what do you need to go home? What they said was, we don't want to see Hezbollah outside our windows anymore. We don't want their flags. We don't want them shining laser beams into our living rooms at night. We don't want to hear them digging. We don't want them to be able to fire Cornet anti-tank guided missiles into our homes and cars anymore. That means 10 kilometers.
So all of this is happening as Hezbollah continues to fire rockets and missiles and drones into Israel. You mentioned the residents who have been displaced from northern Israel, about 100,000 or so Israelis who are still living in hotels. The diplomacy that you mentioned, what's the breaking point here? How long are negotiations going to continue? How long can Israel tolerate for there to be negotiations until Israel has to actually take action itself?
Excellent questions without clear answers. The hope has been that there would be prospects for a pause in the south, not only to be able to bring home some of the hostages, which is obviously of paramount importance and a huge social, emotional, and political issue in Israel, but also to provide a pause that would give Hezbollah a face-saving moment to say, okay, the fighting has stopped, we can stop. Hezbollah said they won't stop firing into Israel until Israel stops fighting in Gaza. They're saying that they're doing this in support of Palestinians, but the truth is Hezbollah has been looking for ways to kind of resurrect its resistance. It would call it resistance. I would call it terrorism credentials, since it fought in Syria where it was killing Muslims. And the head of Hezbollah famously said at the time, the road to Jerusalem went through Damascus, which just meant he was never good at elementary school geography. They've always wanted to be able to refocus on Israel. If there were to be a pause in the south, that conceivably could give the space for a pause in the north. Short of that, I don't have the answer as to where the breaking point is for Israel. Obviously, these civilians from the north can't stay away from their homes forever. Unlike in the south, where their homes are mostly destroyed, in the north, mostly people have homes to go back to. It's just not safe to be there.
So we've laid out a lot here, and as we look at the threat that Hezbollah poses to Israel, the threat that Hezbollah poses to American interests and to the broader region, what is in America's best interest here in these next critical few months, and how should America try to achieve it?
So first of all, I think as Americans, we should be proud of the way the United States, in a nonpartisan, bipartisan way, has stood by Israel, going so far as to send 2 aircraft carrier groups to the Eastern Mediterranean. You know, Hezbollah's leader, Hassan Nasrallah, spent about 25 minutes saying, I don't even see those boats are in there. They don't. When you spend 25 minutes telling me how much you don't see them, my takeaway is, I see the boats. I'm not going to do anything because of the boats. And I think that made a big difference. The resupply of weapons, all of that, critically important. Hezbollah is a group that is not only a threat to Israel. Until 9/11, Hezbollah was responsible for the deaths of more Americans than any other terrorist group. And Hezbollah operatives have been caught here in the United States doing surveillance of FBI buildings, federal buildings, all kinds of different things. They've never carried out an attack here, but they want to be ready to be able to do it should they be called upon to do so. And that's a concern for us generally. And then more broadly, I think that the events post-October 7th showed that even as it makes all the sense in the world to pivot to Asia and to rationalize our counterterrorism posture and all that, if you don't visit the Middle East will visit you. We have tremendous interests in the region, economic interests, geopolitical interests, allies, and if we aren't going to play a role there in support of our allies, including but not only Israel, then things get bad. And so we've played a stabilizing role. It's in our interest to do so, and we're going to have to be able to have some ability to stay with it as Israel finishes what it needs to do to dismantle the Hamas governance project in Gaza, to deter Hezbollah from getting involved in the war and firing rockets ad infinitum at Israel, and getting to the point of the dust settling. That's going to take some time, and it means we're going to have to be able to stick with it for a little bit longer.
One final question for you. You talked about that stabilizing role of the United States. President Biden has requested a $14.3 billion security aid package for Israel. Talk to us about, from your perspective, the importance of that security aid being passed by Congress and what that affords Israel, and the effect that it has on the United States and our security here at home.
Look, the bottom line is this has been a tremendously expensive war for Israel, and what it needs more than anything else is to restock its supplies. And in particular, while Hamas spent millions of dollars to build tunnels and infrastructure to attack and kill other people, and spent not a dime to defend or protect Palestinians, Israel has invested tremendous amounts of time and effort and money, with America's help, technological and financial both, to do things like build Iron Dome. But the interceptors from Iron Dome can only come from 2 places in the world, Israel and the United States. So especially these tools that enable to defend Israel from the kind of attacks we saw on October 7th and since are critically important. This also helps America, not only in terms of deterring our adversaries, Iran is pushing very hard to reshape the Middle East, but also to protect our allies, which include Israel and the Gulf states and others. And then finally, when the United States gives military aid to Israel, that's military funds that Israel is spending in the United States, and it's helping to drive our economy. That's not the primary reason to do it. The primary reason to do it is to protect the one true democratic country in the region, to be able to, so it can protect itself when foreigners are trying to invade it and massacre its civilians.
Dr. Matthew Levitt, thank you for being with us today, and thank you for your expert insight.
Thanks for having me.
As Israel continues its war with Hamas, the need for America's support is more important than ever. That's why we're asking you to contact your members of Congress and urge them to vote for emergency aid for Israel. Text Israel to the number on your screen, 24722, to contact your elected officials and tell them that we must pass this legislation that ensures America stands with Israel in this moment of need. That's all for our episode on Lebanon today. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you soon.